We begin in Ukraine, where air raid sirens sounded across the country today as Russia launched a new wave of airstrikes. Government warnings sent Ukrainians across the country into metro stations and other makeshift bomb shelters. Russian planes reportedly fired dozens of missiles targeting key infrastructure in Ukraine. The latest strikes came just hours after multiple explosions at two military bases deep inside Russia, hundreds of kilometers from the border with Ukraine. The Kremlin is blaming Ukrainian drones for the attacks on the Russian bases. I spoke earlier to our correspondent in Kyiv, Nick Connolly, and asked what more he could tell us about the explosions.
Well, that's the extraordinary thing, right? I think just this morning when the first news of this broke, no one really, even here in Kyiv, kind of wanted to kind of really believe. They just kind of seemed incredible that Ukraine would be in a position to strike targets so far away from its borders, so deep in kind of Russian, kind of the heartland, and even more so, one of these bases is used for the bombing, bombers for the kind of infrastructure for Russia's nuclear deterrent. So if Russia is not able to defend an airbase where it has its nuclear deterrent hundreds of miles away from Ukraine, what can it defend? What is Russia's anti-aircraft capability up to? Seemingly it's less capable than what Ukraine has kind of pieced together in 9 months of war. And now we've seen first pictures emerging from, seemingly at least, and alleged to be from the runways, from those air bases, of damaged Russian planes, of blood on the tarmac. We're hearing that several people died. The Ukrainian sources claiming more casualties than the Russians so far admitted to. The Russian army spokesman claimed that this was a Soviet drone. Not something that really makes a lot of sense and doesn't kind of match any of the kind of predictions from outside analysts. But it seems like there is like a real scramble now in Russia to kind of explain this away, especially for their domestic audience, because this is essentially a pretty humiliating day for them and really brings back memories of the summer when Ukraine was able to basically deal with Russia's main kind of flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, to sink that. And that was something they basically spent weeks trying to distract from because it was just something they couldn't really have ever imagined.
I'm joined now by Dr. Domitila Sagramoso. She's an expert on Russian security and development at King's College in London. Dr. Sagramoso, welcome to the day. Russia, we just heard it, is accusing Ukraine of attacking two of its air bases with drones. How likely is that?
It seems that the Ukrainians have developed sort of these attack drone capabilities that can reach, well beyond the borders. There is references to these attack drones being able to fly at least 1,000 kilometers. So I think it is quite significant that the Ukrainians have been able to develop these kind of capabilities. I think it was probably in response to the reluctance of the West and the US in particular to provide longer range weapons that could hit at the Russian territory further afield. So I think this is very significant.
Ukraine having the capability of striking really so deep into Russia, what would it mean for the conflict?
What is also very relevant is that these two bases, they host, Russia's strategic bombers, which are very relevant, because they could carry potentially nuclear weapons. So you're really hitting at one of the elements of the so-called nuclear triad. So it's a very sensitive of aircraft that Russia has been that the attack has carried out. So that is very significant. It apparently is possible because drones fly much lower and at a very different speed. So the air defense systems of Russia have not been prepared for that. Ukrainians have had a lot of time to sort of prepare for countering, drone attacks. But I think Russians haven't really thought about that so carefully. And I think that, that will mean that Russians will have to really start thinking about their own vulnerabilities, that the possibility of attacks deep inside Russian territory can happen. We must remember that in the summer, in August, there was an attack on an airbase in Crimea, a Russian airbase in Crimea, and many aircraft were also destroyed. So this is not the first time that Russia suffers significant sort of attacks to its air bases, but Crimea is different to the rest of Russia and Russian territory. Of course, Crimea is not Russian territory; it's annexed territory.
Yeah.
I think that this is, I don't think it's going to change significantly the conduct of the war. I mean, the attacks that occurred today on Ukrainian territory by Russian missiles. I think these were planned and by Russian aircraft. I think these were planned already. We know that a few days ago there were all these airplanes that had been positioned in some of these bases that were under attack today. And so I think that it's very difficult to say that this was actually retaliation.
Could it change people's perception of the war, though? Sorry to interrupt you there, but could this, in a way, inside of Russia, legitimize Russia's rhetoric of self-defense?
Well, I think Russia doesn't need this kind of rhetoric. I mean, of course, you know, it will frighten many, and especially those living in those areas. So it will bring the war closer to home. So that will have an impact. It could help to maybe mobilize people. But I think by now, the Russian public know that, you know, there are a lot of issues around this, what they call special military operation. So I don't think that this is something that will massively mobilize the population, because there wasn't a really high number of casualties. The military are going to be very worried, but I don't think that the population is going to feel so much under threat, because there wasn't a massive, you know, sort of killing of the population. There were a few casualties, which probably were military personnel on the airbase. Of course, the rhetoric is going to increase, and the argumentation that Russia has every right to carry out this operation is going to be even more vociferous. But I don't think that is changing anything at this stage, because if we listen at what, you know, these pundits on television are saying, you know, they couldn't really carry a more aggressive and sort of vociferous campaign. So I really don't see much more. I don't think that this will lead to sort of nuclear escalation, although there might be calls for that. So I really think that what instead it will show is that Ukraine has the ability to deter and to limit, you know, attacks on its territory if it starts hitting at the bases where many of these strategic bombers actually fly off to hit Ukraine. So
now, with these vulnerabilities exposed, what do you think will Putin's next move be?
Well, I think he will continue, you know, bombarding in the way he did today. I mean, the Russian armed forces were bombarding, as you were reporting, you know, civilian infrastructure, energy infrastructure. I think they're going to continue along those lines, because although militarily they're not able to stop the Ukrainian offensive, they really, you know, have a toll on the local population. It makes it very hard. It's very costly to restore everything. You know, it has psychologically, it's very difficult for the population to live through these blackouts. And what is happening is Russia is timing these attacks in such a way that they take place when Ukraine has more or less restored the power system. And so again, there is an attack. And that is really to demoralize. It's a sort of psychological warfare intended to demoralize the population, that whenever everything is again in place and energy is coming back, then it is hit again. So they are leaving these spaces purposefully so that there is time to repair. And then when it is ready and repaired, then they hit again. And I think that is part of some kind of psychological operation to really diminish and break the Ukrainian will to continue fighting. I think at the moment this still has not had any positive effects from the Russian point of view, but I think they're going to continue. They're going to continue also trying to, you know, to attack in the Donbass on the ground. There is efforts to take Bakhmut. There was talk that also apparently they had retreated from the areas around the nuclear power station in Zaporizhzhia from a few villages, but this was a few days ago, and I haven't seen any additional reports. So the situation is a bit flux at the moment.
Domitila Sagramoso, thank you so much for your analysis.